Pair programming first achieved popularity in the late 90s, and it's certainly a product of its time. Back then, many software development organizations were deliberately organized to focus people in isolated roles. The team-based approaches advocated by agile software development really hadn't been popularized yet, and at the time, pair programming was quite revolutionary. In the 2010s, mob programming was codified. And the motto of mob programming is that it brings together all the brilliant minds working together on the same thing at the same time, in the same space, at the same computer. Now, like pair programming, mob programming isn't some academic concept. Someone didn't invent this in their basement. Instead, mob programming evolved from real developers building real software who were adapting pair programming practices to focus on the entire team solving real problems. So in mob programming, you have several people all contributing to a solution at real time. Another aspect of mob programming is that people ought to do what works right for them and for their team, and to learn from the process and to adopt it locally. And so while there are some guidelines or lots of really good ways to get started, the particular techniques aren't meant to be always and forever. Just like pair programming, mob programming we provide to really any problem that needs to be solved. So whether you're doing research on a problem, whether testing a big piece of functionality, designing what the user experience should be, all of that can be mobbed. Concurrently with mob programming, there are people who are also defining something called ensemble programming, which shares a lot of the same ethic, the same goals, the same mindset, and the same techniques, but they called it ensemble programming. So the intent with mob programming is that people swarm together on complex problems to achieve a high-performance result. So together they break down a complex task into smaller, less complex ones. And they rally around these simpler problems so that they can innovate and provide more automation in their processes so they can go faster. In particular, toilsome activities, things that are repetitive, things that are boring, will not be tolerated by a team like an individual might. Right? We can all think of things where it's like, well, it's only costing me a minute to do this thing manually. I don't need to automate it. But all of a sudden, when there are 8 people who are waiting a minute looking at the screen while a slow process occurs, they're much more motivated to automate something. So given that swarming had these attributes, why not swarm on all the problems? Well, just like with pair programming, working together provides immediate feedback and accelerates learning. And it allows all of the best ideas from all the team members to make it into the solution. So you end up with a really great solution. When there's gap in knowledge, either among specific individuals or the team as a whole, you can fill those gaps and everybody benefits from it. So they're filled for all team members. Similarly, the cognitive load of doing the work is spread among multiple people. So it's actually overall less toilsome to do the work because you have multiple people sharing the load. So as a result, you get high quality outputs much sooner. There's some discussion in the mob and ensemble communities about the words that are used here. And in this lecture, I use them interchangeably. But there are some connotations that the words mob and ensemble have that are largely unintentional that I want to call out. So when you think of the word mob, you think of something that is dynamic, maybe a little chaotic, riotous even, without a leader. Where ensemble, you think of an ensemble as being more controlled, something that is conducted or more collegial and well organized. Mobbing, you might think of jazz music, right? A couple of people who it's really intense and they're working together to make something brand new. Where an ensemble, you think of classical music, where you've got maybe a larger group and everybody's working in lockstep to create something that is still beautiful, but maybe a little bit more familiar. Of course, as someone who is delivering a lecture on mob and ensemble programming, I can't help but call out that mob is 1 syllable to say, and ensemble has 3 syllables. And so, my tongue gets a little tired after saying ensemble too many times. People have also called out that the word ensemble translates to non-English languages better, where, again, mob has these connotations. So these aren't good or bad per se, and the reality is that mob programming and ensemble programming are very similar. So reality is somewhere in the middle for all of those. When I talk about mobbing or ensembling, which I probably will never do, the techniques and the values and the attitudes are essentially the same. So just like with pair programming, a little bit of structure can really help mob programming get off to a good start. Forming a mob, the team size should be about 6 people and working on a relatively small problem. A code kata is a great place to start. The idea here isn't on day one to solve some really complex problem. The idea is to explore how to mob, how to collaborate with others, how to be a good participant in the mob, no matter what your role is. In mobbing, participation is voluntary. If it's really not somebody wants to do that day, that week, or even at all, they don't have to. When mob programming, you need to have one computer that's projected where everyone can see the same thing. It's important that the physical setup allow everybody to access all the information equally. Similarly, you want to make sure the environment is comfortable. So to have chairs that people can feel comfortable sitting in, you want to have multiple keyboards so that multiple people can contribute, and maybe even multiple mice. Leverage the technology that's available to have a good setup. Again, like with pairing, when mobbing, rotate roles every couple of minutes so that everyone has a chance to write code, and also so everyone has a chance not to code. You want to make sure that everybody can experience all the roles so they can contribute all they can to the greater conversation. We'll talk more about this in a little bit, but when mobbing, try to show kindness, consideration, and respect to people. And periodically reflect in retrospect on what you've been doing. After every session, maybe after you've reached a milestone, look back and talk about what worked and what didn't work. Now, lots of people have experienced mob programming remotely, where people aren't in the same physical area. This can still be very effective, however, requires some slightly different rules. So as we were talking about at the beginning, lots of people in lots of different roles contribute to software development. So it begs the question, who should be part of the mob? Well, it really depends. If someone feels they can contribute value to the mob, they should be part of it. So these are the people that have the knowledge to help make decisions, to help implement those decisions, and validate the results, regardless of who they are or what their role is. It's perfectly fine for people to come and go over the course of a mobbing day, as long as it's effective and not disruptive. So if someone feels that they're no longer adding value to the mob, they should leave and find a way they can better contribute to the overall goals. So this means that people who are developers who write code, people who test code, product experts, operations engineers, people that understand the business domain, facilitators, they can all be part of the mob. Now, of course, after a mob reaches a certain size, it will lose some of its effectiveness if it's too big. So it's something that you need to balance and keep an eye on. And remember, software development, the act of programming, is not just writing code. It's about translating user needs into working software. So there's plenty of work to go around, and plenty of people in many different roles can contribute to this. Earlier, we had learned about the driver and navigator roles in pair programming, and those roles are carried over into mob programming and expanded a little bit. Mob and ensemble programming have multiple navigators, and the navigators are once again the brains. They think about the problem, discuss solutions, write diagrams, decide what to do, and share ideas on how to move forward. Now, this isn't a free-for-all shouting match. It's a discussion in which navigators take turns talking. That's something that needs to be facilitated, but the mob will figure out how to do it over time. Much like in pair programming, the driver translates the ideas that the navigators come up with into code. However, there's a little less discussion in the driver, and we'll dive into details here shortly. Now, with multiple navigators, it can be difficult for the driver to know exactly what to type. So there's usually a designated navigator role who channels the ideas from the other navigators to the driver. This is called the voices. So you've got the navigators who are the brains that do the thinking, you have the driver who are the hands that do the typing, and then there's the designated navigator who channels all the voices into a single stream of information to the driver. The designated navigator term comes from Ensemble Programming. You may also hear the designated navigator role being referred to as simply the navigator, and the other navigators as mobbers. So you end up with the navigator, the driver, and the mobbers. In mob programming, every couple of minutes, people change their roles. The driver becomes a navigator, and someone else becomes the driver and the designated navigator. So I'd like to explain a little bit about the mindset that informs mob programming. Here are some simple rules. Rotate on a timer. This establishes a good discipline of making sure that everybody has an opportunity to contribute in multiple roles. When rotating from one driver to another, follow the yes and principle, which basically says don't throw everything away that the last driver did, continue the work that was in progress, and improve it to meet the current needs. In mobbing, no decisions are made at the keyboard. It's the navigators who determine what the driver codes, and so the driver needs to resist the urge to implement things the way they think is right and take direction from the navigators. Because don't worry, that driver will be a navigator very shortly, and they'll have an opportunity to influence in that navigator role. Once again, navigators should speak in the highest level of abstraction possible that the driver can understand. It's usually not appropriate to tell the driver exactly what to type on the keyboard, but more generally say things like create a method or create an object or an instance of this class. Have a bias towards action. Again, it's better to experiment with an actual solution than to ponder multiple solutions endlessly. At all times, every participant in the mob should be learning something new, contributing to the solution, or ideally both. Being idled or disengaged is not effective. And again, show kindness, consideration, and respect for everyone involved. And remember that being kind isn't always the same as being nice. Sometimes you need to call things as you see them, and that means being critical and providing feedback. But there are effective ways of doing that, and then there are ineffective ways of doing that. We've talked about these three values that inform mobbing behaviors a little bit, and I want to dive into a little bit of detail just to make sure that everybody's clear on them. So when mobbing, be kind. Exhibit kindness. So this means when you're working with others, be warm-hearted and pleasant and gentle and polite. It'll make things easier and will help people become engaged. And you can do this by, in your words and in your actions, showing genuine concern for and interest in the people around you. So notice when someone is maybe a little confused, is starting to get disengaged, or has something they want to express. You can exhibit the consideration value by listening to others with humility. Hold your own ideas loosely and be open to the ideas of others. When figuring out what to do the work to figure out how to try other ideas instead of focusing only on reasons not to try them. And you can show respect when mob programming by acting without judgment to allow others to maintain their self-esteem. Again, it's ineffective to put someone down or make someone feel negatively about the work that they're doing or the work that they'd like to contribute. And when disagreements happen, and they will, disagree respectfully and in a way that lets ideas flourish within the mob. So in addition to those very high-level values, here are some behaviors that inform the mobbing mindset. These behaviors help to build an environment in which individuals feel safe expressing their ideas without fear of ridicule or retribution. So be sure to acknowledge the good and the bad. Work to amplify the good and to change it so the bad things don't happen again. Again, the driver in their role, they don't make decisions while at the keyboard. They merely implement the decisions made by the navigators. And this is because the navigators purposefully are looking at a bigger picture and the driver is focused on something very specific and tactical. You can help to build the environment that you want by calling out the ideas that people have and giving credit and attribution for the ones that work. It can be very effective for the more experienced navigators to yield certain decisions and to yield the floor to less experienced navigators. Over time, what this will do is it'll increase the overall capacity of the team. When exploring solutions, try as many ideas as you can. Start with the less likely candidates, explore them for a little bit, and figure out if you need to move on to others. And mobbing can be intense, so stay focused on the ensemble and what you're doing, and take a break when you need one. This is where it really helps to have that timer, which will build in breaks. And because mobbing is a learning experience, frequently retrospect on the team's experiences, identify areas that you can improve, and figure out how you're going to move forward. Now let's look at some of the roles in an ensemble and talk in more detail about what that role does. So you can think of the driver as an intelligent input device. And drivers can help the ensemble by asking clarifying questions and requesting navigation on different levels of abstraction. Maybe the navigator is talking at too high a level and a driver needs to ask, hey, can you tell me what to type? There are those times, especially when someone is new to the programming language or to the development environment. A driver can also type something controversial, so maybe code that's structured a little unusually to focus attention, and that'll help the navigators see that what they're asking the driver to do isn't necessarily clear. Because the driver's at the keyboard, they have the unique opportunity to teach others about the tool that's being used. So let's say you're working in front of a code editor, an integrated development environment, or you're working on the command line. The driver is the person who's best suited to show off a new keyboard shortcut or a new command line tool. The driver can help reinforce the role of the designated navigator by ignoring instructions that come from other navigators. This is true of all roles, but the driver can also help amplify voices of least privilege by being a sponsor, by saying, "I haven't heard from this person in a while, what do you think?" They can also, because they're writing the code, they can also take a look at the code and identify code that needs improvement, whether it's hard to read, whether there's duplication, or it's overly complex. It's difficult for the driver to focus just on typing, just on being that intelligent input device, and not overly exerting influence on the direction of the mob. So here are some patterns, some anti-patterns for how a mob's driver may behave. And by understanding these, you can be more effective as a driver. So there are four of them. The first one's called plowing through. We'll talk about driving on autopilot, thinking out loud, and just tell me what to write. Now, a driver is said to be plowing through when they ignore input from the rest of the mob and just write the code themselves without even talking about it. This is more likely to occur when you have a driver who is more experienced and passionate about the work. A mob may also find that a driver is plowing through if it's unclear whether or not others in the mob agree with the approach. It's possible that the mobbers are confused, or maybe they've lost focus. When you have a driver who's plowing through, it's likely to result in the distracted non-participants pattern, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Similarly, if a driver is driving on autopilot, they're ignoring the input from the navigator, and they're implementing whatever they believe to be correct. So there's discussion happening, it's just that the driver's ignoring it. So if you've got a driver who is operating in either one of these patterns, either plowing through or driving on autopilot, the thinking out loud pattern might be a good solution to that. When thinking out loud, the driver articulates, literally narrates, what they're thinking as they type. And they actively check for understanding with the mob. And this is something that's ideally triggered by the driver themselves, but if they don't notice that they've fallen into the plowing through or driving on autopilot pattern, the navigators can respectfully ask the driver to think out loud. There can also be times where the driver just doesn't have the context to understand what the navigators are saying. This often occurs when there are a couple of people in the mob who have context on the problem and the driver doesn't. In this case, the tell me what to write pattern can help. The driver can trigger this pattern by asking questions like, well, where in the code do we need to change exactly? What class performs this action? Or how should we test this? Again, when answering these questions for the driver, the navigators need to be careful to speak at the appropriate level of abstraction that the driver is familiar with. So even though they might not understand a particular API or a particular design pattern, if the driver knows how to write the code, if they're familiar with the language and the tools used to write it, don't treat them like a stenographer. So let's talk about the role of the navigator, and I mean the designated navigator, in an ensemble. So the navigator helps the ensemble by filtering ideas from everybody else and providing a high-level intent to the driver. Specifically, describing a failing test and then guiding the driver towards implementing a passing one is a really effective way to get the job done. Navigators can also serve as a researcher who answers questions and finds and shares relevant information from outside of the mob, so doing a web search, for instance. The navigator has a good viewpoint that allows them to point out repeated processes or code. These are often good candidates for automation. The navigator can also play the role of a conductor who enhances the contributions of others. So for instance, the navigator can seek out ideas from people who are quiet, haven't spoken in a while, or who have the least privilege in the room. And sometimes a navigator can be very effective by proposing a bad idea in order to generate ideas for better ones from the rest of the mob. Now, the other navigators in the ensemble, or the mobbers, they can help out by contributing their ideas and making room for voices of less privilege. Mobbers can also ask questions to help gain understanding among the entire mob. In a situation where the designated navigator maybe isn't the most experienced person in the room, other mobbers can help that navigator towards potential paths by being the rear admiral. We'll talk more about this in a little bit, but the rear admiral gently guides the navigator towards potential paths to success. The mobbers can also record alternative approaches so that they're not forgotten in case they need to be accessed later. They can also be the archivist, who describes observations about what the ensemble has learned to inform how they perform in the future. Experience shows that many times the navigator who appears to be the slowest can provide the most insight. They're slow because either they're just a naturally deliberate person, or maybe they're not as experienced as everybody else. And the act of explaining and educating someone about a complex problem helps generate learning for everyone. In mob programming, it's important to realize that everybody contributes to the solution and deserves credit for the work that's well done. So beyond the basic three roles of driver, navigator, and mobber, additional advanced mobbing roles have been identified over time. Now, these more advanced roles are not recommended for day one of mobbing, and should be introduced once people have experience working in the fundamental three roles. But learning about these roles and keeping them in the back of your mind can help you more effectively mob and give you some tools that you can apply in particular situations. Just like the three fundamental roles in mob programming, these more advanced roles should switch every few minutes. They aren't always and forever. And note that no mob will have all of these roles all the time. There are too many of them. I list 11 of them above. The mob would be too big to be effective. So let's talk briefly about each of these more advanced mobbing roles. A researcher on the mob helps by looking outside of the mob for information left by others. So this is someone who reads over documentation, looks at blogs, coding forums, to help understand more about the solution that the mob is pursuing. They might also look in other parts of the code for clues on what to do next. A sponsor is an advanced role whose focus is to amplify voices to uncover blind spots and unlock the greatness in others. So they encourage participation by people who maybe haven't made their voices heard yet. They focus on supporting the contributions of the mobber with least privilege, and privilege based on seniority, gender, race, class, etc. And sponsors also look to celebrate moments of excellence within the ensemble. As I mentioned before, the rear admiral's role is to quietly advise the navigator to move the navigator forward through the problem. This often occurs when the navigator is less experienced than other members of the mob, and so the rear admiral gives the smallest cue necessary. And this is hard. It's a challenge to be able to give just enough information for someone to move forward, not just tell them what to do. And again, it's really important that the rear admiral speak at the highest level of abstraction the navigator can work with. An automationist on the mob identifies opportunities to replace work that is toilsome with automated processes in order to amplify the overall capabilities of the mob. So an automationist will point out repeated actions in the code or in the tools, or aspects of a process that don't need to be repeated. An automationist will notice boilerplate code that the driver has to type over and over again, and advocates for implementing automation to replace these toilsome activities. A nose on the mob is on the lookout for smelly code that adds complexity. So the nose will do things like point out long lines of code or a conditional which it ends up getting more and more complex, methods that are multiple screens long, names that don't make any sense any longer, things like that. And the nose will propose that action be taken to clean up the code, refactoring or maybe even removing things that don't make sense anymore. A nostalgist is focused beyond the code being written and looks at the overall behavior and experiences of the mob. A nostalgist can help the mob understand how they want to work in the future. So oftentimes the nostalgist will propose a quick break to do a retrospective on how the team's been working, and the nostalgist will encourage the mob to identify the things that they want to continue and the ineffective things they want to diminish. The archivist role, which is also known as the recorder role, makes the work, ideas, and discoveries the mob does visible for the mob right now in the present and to future mobs. So the archivist will articulate the task at hand to ensure that there is shared understanding among the entire mob. The archivist also will capture and record alternatives that the mob may be considered but ultimately chose to abandon. This way, those options are not forgotten in the future. Similarly, the big design decisions that matter and other technical details that inform the implementation, it's important for those to be captured, and especially the motivation or the why behind those particular decisions were made. The archivist also keeps track of the external resources that were used, so you can go back and consult them later. And finally, the archivist can also make sure that future plans for testing, deployment, operating in production are all considered, and things like the first draft of the documentation, whether it be user-facing documentation or technical documentation, is sketched out so that once the mob is done for the day, they'll have a good plan for the future. The traffic cop role helps establish and enforce the rules of the road. And these rules of the road apply to how the mob works amongst itself. So the traffic cop might suggest a new and relevant way of doing their work. The traffic cop also points out when the mob isn't following its own agreements. The traffic cop can help the mob remind itself of what task it's currently focusing on and why it's important. And the traffic cop can also make note of the decisions and expectations that the team wants to set for the future. And finally, a traffic cop, just like anybody, can keep an eye on the overall energy of the mob and when it gets fatigued or needs a break and suggest that they take one. An anthropologist on the mob maintains the history of the team and what it's doing to enable future learning. So when the mob reflects on its own habits, the anthropologist might lead that facilitation and then capture the knowledge and learning in an accessible artifact that the mob can then consult in the future. The disciplinarian role reminds the mob about their technical practices. So this is not so much about the communication styles and behaviors of the team as much as it is the technical practices that the mob wants to take on. So for instance, a disciplinarian might encourage strong test-driven development practices. So making sure that the team always writes a failing test first before writing the code that makes it pass. It can also encourage practices like refactoring code, but not until after all the tests are green. The disciplinarian can also be on the lookout for code that isn't clean. So for instance, method and variable names that are unclear, or you have code segments that are duplicated many times, or coding styles that aren't consistent, which can happen a lot when you've got multiple people serving in the driver role. The major pain role on a mob highlights the pain that are felt in processes, interactions, or tools. But when shining a light on the pain, this role must show empathy while asking about things that are most certainly painful. A major pain may also notice pain that is repeated often and amplify it because it might be ignored by the mob. And the major pain also advocates for retrospectives to inspect the pain and then adapt the team's behaviors based on it. On the other hand, the Dr. Feelgood role amplifies what's good about the mob and make sure to remind it about the effective behaviors and the effective results. So a Dr. Feelgood might show appreciation to a mobber or to a stakeholder. And when providing this appreciation, which is a form of feedback, it's often effective to use the SBI model, the situation, behavior, and the impact. And by calling out the situation, behavior, and the impact, it makes it very clear when the effective behavior happened and why it was important. So for instance, when offering feedback, it might look something like this. When we were all stuck on how to use the file API, it really helped that you posted the link to the documentation. As a result, we were able to fix the broken unit test quickly. Dr. Feelgood also gathers feedback about the happiness expressed by others. So when someone cheers or has a big smile on their face, Dr. Feelgood will engage that person to understand why and what it means. And Dr. Feelgood also calls for a retrospective to explore not what went wrong, but what went well, and how to amplify more of it. A facilitator is a more advanced role that guides the mob towards working together better. This is especially important when you have a new mob that is still forming or is still learning how to mob program. So the facilitator encourages participation by everybody in the mob. Facilitator also helps keep the mob on task and calls out when an immediate goal is not clear. And like many other roles, the facilitator will monitor the energy and call for a break or a retrospective when needed. Finally, a devil's advocate is an advanced role that purposefully contradicts whatever the prevailing wisdom is in the mob, or challenges the current approach to make sure that the best outcome is achieved. The devil's advocate purposefully questions the reasoning behind designs and how they're implemented. However, it's really important that a devil's advocate from a place of respect and kindness. You're not just being a jerk. And so oftentimes, if you're playing the devil's advocate role, you need to remind people that that's the role that you're playing because it can come off as very contrarian and conflicting. So those are some more advanced roles that individuals on the mob can take on. I would also like us to explore some collaboration patterns that can occur within the mob. And again, there are some patterns that have worked and some anti-patterns that you need to be on the lookout for. So when mobbing, it's really easy for great ideas to pile up. It's easy to forget them or worry or dedicate a lot of energy to worrying about not forgetting them. So a pattern that can help with that is creating something called a punch list. Basically, what you do is you write down all the things that you want to do and you keep them in a list that can be reviewed and prioritized. It'll help you understand where to go next, where to go tomorrow, or maybe never where to go. And what this does is it allows the mob to see the entire picture and empowers them to decide where they want to focus their efforts. A helpful technique when managing a punch list is to understand the impact of various tasks. And maybe what you want to do is group tasks that impact similar parts of the code base or work in similar subsystems and perform those tasks one after another so that the mob can retain focus on a single part of the code base. There's a collaboration anti-pattern called ride and shotgun. And so if you're not familiar with this term, ride and shotgun refers to the person who sits in a car's passenger seat. They have access to many of the controls of the car. They can change the temperature, they can adjust the radio, but they are not driving. In mob programming, a mobber is riding shotgun when an individual dominates the mob. It's almost always a navigator type. It's very easy for someone to be riding shotgun when they know a lot or are very passionate about what the mob is doing, and so they dominate and their voice is heard more than others. But the downside of this is that you might end up with distracted non-participants. These are people who are present in the mob, but they're not participating. And as a result, fewer questions are asked, learning is decreased because people aren't able to contribute what they know and ask the questions that they have. There are times where riding shotgun might make sense in the moment, but you should limit those moments because it can be very detrimental to the mob over the long term. And at worst, if you have a couple of people who are vying for riding shotgun, the mob may devolve into a fight club in which guiding principles of mutual respect and consideration are thrown out the window and everybody's arguing. And that's just wasteful and not effective. Sometimes it makes sense for an individual who is very vocal within the mob to take a step back from their involvement to make room for others. So maybe when you have one or two people who are dominating, or everybody else is quiet and deferring to one voice. And so this collaboration pattern is called mute your mic, meaning that I'm not going to talk for a little while. It's most effective if someone's going to exercise this pattern on themselves, they let everybody know. So maybe after a couple moments of awkward silence, the person who has been speaking the most will say, hey, I'm going to mute my mic so that someone else can speak. Similarly, if one person is dominating and they don't realize it, then other members of the mob can respectively ask that they mute their own mic. When muting your mic, it's often a good opportunity to take on a different role. Become a recorder or a researcher. Contribute to the mob in a different way that doesn't involve you speaking. Sometimes a mob will get to a point where it has to pause and regroup. So for instance, it's blocked from making forward progress, doesn't have access to the information and the tools that it needs, or it realizes that the solution that's currently pursuing is not going to solve the problem, is no longer fit to purpose, or that it realizes that it just doesn't understand the problem well enough to code a solution. There's too many unknowns. This is when the mob can invoke the pause for clarity collaboration. This is when the mob moves away from the keyboard and to a whiteboard or to a collaboration tool where they can have a different kind of conversation that doesn't immediately result in code being written. This happens sometimes. And sometimes a mob just gets burnt out or just needs a longer break and a break away from each other to do something else. And that's fine, right? And so then they can take that longer break to allow them to rejuvenate and let ideas percolate in the back of their mind. Almost always the mob will come back with a better solution and one that they feel more confident about. There are a couple of other behavioral patterns that I'd like to talk about. In particular, when you're changing driver, there's a couple of ways to look at who should be the next driver. There's something called the natural swap that occurs when a driver asks for someone else to drive. So either they're done or they've sort of reached a point where it's like, I don't feel like I'm the right person to drive anymore. They'll ask for someone else. Similarly, If a navigator really wants to take the keyboard and it makes sense to do so, a natural swap can happen then. Other times, though, there's a forced swap. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that it is something that swap definitely happens, as opposed to a natural swap, which is more of a discussion. So a forced swap happens when the timer has expired. So anyway, every few minutes, switch roles. A forced swap can also happen when energy is low among the mob. If you have a lot of distracted non-participants, people who aren't engaged, good time to swap. And also, if a driver reaches a point where they want to navigate, where they have some ideas and have some knowledge that aren't appropriate for them to contribute as a driver, they can ask to be swapped out. Similarly, there's also a pattern called a forced break, which is when the facilitator senses that the mob needs to recharge, when energy is waning, when lots of people are distracted non-participants. That's when the mob can just take a break for 10 or 15 minutes to regroup and recharge. So that's a lot about mob programming, and you may be asking yourself, how can this possibly work? We've got all these people trying to work together, and how can this be better than people just doing stuff individually? Well, the hidden magic to mobbing is that it removes many of the causes of lost productivity. So even though you have more people working on quote-unquote the same thing, they're working much more effectively and efficiently. So for instance, mobbing removes the context switching to other work, distractions that come in, whether it's an email, whether it's like you decide to check your social media, people are more focused. Because people aren't as tired when mob programming, you don't end up with the bad code that happens when you're tired, you're not thinking, you're just trying to get it done and not putting your full energy behind it. In mobbing, you don't need to wait for others to get questions answered or to make decisions. So you don't have to call a meeting and get on everybody's calendar. Nope, everybody right there is focused. And so decisions get made and implemented much, much faster. Similarly, you don't need to go refining requirements. Most likely, the people in the mob have enough information to be able to make a decision that if it's not the right one, it's certainly good enough for now so you can move forward. Because there's constant feedback in mobbing, you don't end up with defects and you don't have gaps in your testing code because they're caught immediately. It's what the mob provides is rapid feedback that leads to higher quality. Because everybody's working together all the time in a mob, you don't need to provide status reports. You don't necessarily need to have a stand-up where you tell everybody else on the team what you're doing. Everybody knows what you're doing because you're doing it together. Because there's more interpersonal interaction, any conflicts that occur get resolved much faster. So you don't go days, weeks, or months being angry, confused, or concerned about your ability to work with other people. In mobbing, you don't need to wait for code to be approved before it's integrated for others to use. And if there is a tool or an environment that doesn't work very well, it's identified very quickly and its impact is amplified, and therefore it's much more likely to be resolved when an entire mob is focusing on it. So again, mobbing works because the focus of a mob is to be effective. That's getting work done. More so than being individually productive, just doing work. It's not enough to just do work or be busy. You need to get work done. And what mobbing allows you to do is get more work done because it removes many of the impediments to increased effectiveness. So, in summary, what we all want is our work to be meaningful for us to produce great results. And great results come from people who work together to leverage all their skills, all their knowledge, all their experiences to deliver the best software solution they can, as fast as they can. Beyond the tools and technologies, the languages, the APIs, the services, all of those things, how people work together will determine their success. By leveraging techniques like pair programming, mob programming, ensemble programming, and taking a structured approach to them, it's much more likely that knowledge and learning will be spread across the entire team to maximize the capability of the greater group. These approaches will help speed decisions to identify solutions that are innovative much faster than people working on their own or collaborating asynchronously. Working together will help establish a more sustainable pace of work overall, where you don't have heroes and zeros, you have everybody contributing equally to the solution. It'll help strike a balance between solutions that are not sufficient and ones that are too much, gold-plated, extra features, pre-optimizations that aren't needed. Working together can also help reinforce effective practices, both technical practices and behavioral practices, and reinforce them in the moment and not just in hindsight. Not saying, well, it's been 2 weeks and, oh, we really should have done that differently. Nope. It's, hey, we just tried that 2 minutes ago and it didn't work. Let's try something else. And these methods of working together can also help focus collaboration, communication, and documentation on the things that matter. So you don't end up with wasted meetings or lots of communication that goes nowhere or documentation that nobody reads. Pairing and mobbing help focus on the things that matter. Now, I didn't invent any of this, and while I've experienced it, I want to certainly acknowledge the giants on whose shoulders that we all stand. There have been a number of people that have contributed to the definition, the implementation, and the refinement of pair programming and mob programming. And here I list a number of the resources that I used for this lecture. I would like to thank the authors for creating this information and sharing it with the world. I encourage all of you to continue learning about pairing and mobbing through these resources.